On July 16th, 1992nd year, Russian President Boris Yeltsin signed a decree on the creation of the Moscow Revival Fund. In the list of objects on the first place, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior on Volkhonka. January 7, 95, in the bright holiday of Christmas, begins construction. Those who had a chance to live through the 90s, the most important Moscow cathedral, rebuilt during this decade, will recall many events: privatization and financial pyramids, the impoverishment of the people and the rise of oligarchs, total markets and criminal strife, pop music, hunger and sexual revolution, television and press without any prohibitions. The emergence of multi-party politics and elections with real intrigue, curators of the West, the destruction of the army and the closing of the factory, great disappointments and faith in a happy future. Some remember the 90s with nostalgia. That was the time. Some with horror. You wouldn't wish the enemy to relive it. But what else nowadays can remind us of the dashing and holy 90s? June 12th in Russia is the red day of the calendar. On this day in 1990 years in the Grand Kremlin Palace, at the first Congress of People's Deputies of the RSFSR, was adopted a declaration of state sovereignty of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. The USSR was then in vital need of renewal. It was going to be reorganized. Gorbachev's perestroika resulted in a severe crisis. The plan was to replace the USSR with the USS, the Union of Sovereign States, to give the republics more local authority and to free Russia from unnecessary financial burden. It is very expensive to maintain a unified administrative apparatus for the whole country, and to date the outskirts, even more so. To do this, all republics had to declare sovereignty. The country held an all-union referendum, which discussed the question, to be or not to be the USSR. Of the 148.5 million people who voted, 76% were in favor of preserving the Union. The signing of the Treaty of the USS was scheduled for August 20th, 91. On the eve of August 19th, there was an attempted coup d'etat in the country. The State Committee on the State of Emergency attempted to disrupt the signing. GKCHP, headed by the Vice President of the Soviet Union, Gennady Yanayev. The putschists expected to be supported by the security forces, the Interior Ministry, the KGB, and the elite units of the Defense Ministry. At 7 in the morning, 3 divisions entered Moscow on combat vehicles and headed for the White House. The White House in the 90s has seen a lot. At noon, the future seat of the Russian government was surrounded by thousands of residents of Moscow. Boris Yeltsin, legitimately elected president of the RSFSR on June 12th in the first all-Russian elections, came out to them and called on them not to obey the GKCHP. We believe that such forceful methods are unacceptable. They discredit the USSR in front of the whole world, undermine our prestige in the world community, return us to the Cold War era and the isolation of the Soviet Union. All this forces us to declare the so-called committee that came to power illegal. The country, especially the youth, was then literally dreaming of the prosperous West. Everyone wanted to travel the world, say what you think, dress nicely, live in their own house, drive their own car, and have the shelves in the stores bursting. For this, as it seemed at the time, it was necessary to embark on the path of democratic reforms as soon as possible. Numerous rallies against the GKCHP took place in all major Russian cities: Leningrad, Novosibirsk, Nizhny Novgorod, Sverdlovsk. The August putsch lasted 3 days. The emergency committee and the army did not dare to use force to go against the people. On December 8, the heads of the Russian Federation, Belarus and Ukraine, Yeltsin, Shushkevich and Kravchuk, respectively, on behalf of the countries that founded the USSR in 1922nd year, announced its dissolution and signed an agreement on the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. The tricolor over the Senate Palace of the Kremlin was raised on December 25th, 1991st year, to replace the lowered flag of the USSR. On that day, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on television and removed the powers of the president of the no longer existing state. One of the first decrees of Boris Yeltsin, who gained almost sole power in Russia, was the Decree on Freedom of Trade. It marked the transition from a centrally planned economy to a market economy. Later market reforms of that time would be called shock reforms. On January 29th, 92nd year, citizens and enterprises of the RSFSR were allowed to engage in the sale of almost all goods in any convenient places. Today it is difficult to imagine the sports complex Luzhniki under the strain filled with market stalls. Until 1998th year, the place of athletes were occupied by shuttlers. Prices were biting, but you could dress and feed yourself, not for everyone. 90th in Russia, the time of unemployment. Design bureaus and scientific institutes were dissolved due to a complete lack of orders and financing. The brain drain took on shocking proportions. One fact alone, almost 100% of promising physicists, nuclear scientists, chemists, and biologists left Russia to work abroad. The reform of the army has sent the military to the streets. The number of armed forces for the first 5 years of the 90s decreased by half, from 3,800,000 in 91st to 1,700,000 in 96th. The MIC, if it worked, were operating at minimal capacity. Plants and factories were closing down. Not only enterprises of Group A, i.e. heavy industry, suffered, but also Group B, i.e. light industry, could not withstand competition with Vietnamese and Chinese products. Today it looks stylish. The territories of former industrial enterprises adapted for art space. In the 90s they were gaping with dreadful emptiness and broken windows. But not all yesterday's Soviet citizens could barely make ends meet. The 90s were also a time of opportunity. In the list of in-demand and therefore money-making professions of those years are businessmen, showmen, journalists, advertisers, accountants. The circulation of the new free media was prohibitive. Arguments and Facts, AIV, 34 million. Moskovsky Komsomolets, 30 million. Komsomolskaya Pravda, 19 million. Trud, 15 million. Izvestia, 12 million. Soviet Russia, 8 million. In the most reading country, everyone wanted to keep up with the latest news. The top TV people had become nouveau riche. In the 90s, they could have been richer than the average businessman. The country caught every breath of the Vzgliad presenters. Listev, Politkovsky, Lyubimy, Molchanov in Before and After Midnight, Medkova and future foreign agent Nevzorov in 600 Seconds. Freedom of speech, not in words, in fact, but journalists' earnings were no match for show business stars. Their fees were up to hundreds of thousands of dollars per concert. True, they had to share with the producers. Not spoiled by the variety of spectacles spectators sometimes gave the last for the concert. Since August 1992nd year came into force, a decree on the introduction of a system of privatization checks. The government promised that transferring state property into private hands would help get rid of unprofitable enterprises, reduce inflation and social tensions, and instantly create a class of small owners. The reform was symbolized by vouchers, which seemed to divide the country's wealth equally among all Russian citizens, but many were let down by financial illiteracy. Vouchers were often sold for next to nothing, changed, and sometimes they were simply given to their bosses so as not to lose their jobs. The deal. As a result of privatization, 65 million Russians sold vouchers, 25 million invested in CFs, Czech investment funds, most of which closed. 40 million were invested in shares of enterprises, which also closed one after another. No more than 1% of ordinary citizens were able to make money on privatization. Then people would say, they cheated us. The reforms were implemented by Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Affairs, Yegor Gaidar, and a team of so-called young reformers. The reformers themselves made money on privatization. It is enough to remember the name of one of them, Anatoly Chubais. Western advisors and their masters were not left out of pocket either. With their direct involvement, controlling stakes in some of Russia's strategic enterprises went to foreign owners, although Gaidar's team proclaimed in words that the country's assets should belong only to compatriots. The results of privatization were officially recognized as unsatisfactory 2 years later. By that time, Gaidar and his team had been dismissed, and the new owners of Russian assets were left to their own devices. For the enterprising and enterprising, for the unscrupulous and shrewd, for the fearless and cruel, the 90s were a time of initial capital accumulation. Where there is money, and even more so, there is crime. In any city cemetery today you can see brotherly alleys. Gangsterism, racketeering, disputes for debts, elimination of competitors in the 90s put in their graves a whole generation of young tough guys. They were called bros back then. A succession of luxurious tombstones evokes mixed feelings. These are the same ones who terrorized, robbed, raped, killed, chained to the radiators, ostentatiously heating irons, and the very ones who were deceived by the gangster romance. According to various estimates, from 1.5 to 2 million men from 17 to 30 years old were in gangs then. Few lived longer. Organized criminal groups, OCG, operated in every city and for some time kept the whole of Russia in fear. The police could not cope with them. They killed, as a rule, at Strelka, that is, where issues were settled, in restaurants, bathhouses, casinos, strip clubs, and just on the streets. Any random passerby could get hit. Street shootings were commonplace. It's really scary. The businessmen, whom the gangsters called commerce, short for commercials, paid for a roof, patronage, and protection, basically for nothing. Racketeering swept Russia. Refusal to pay was punished. The most uncooperative were killed. Easy money became a cult, hence the popular success of the so-called financial pyramids. Fraudsters disguised them as an investment campaign with increased profitability, promising investors huge profits. The swindlers rented a luxurious office. They spared no expense on advertising. By all means let dust in their eyes, trying to attract as many depositors as possible in a short period of time. But crazy profits went to the organizers of pyramids. Depositors received interest for a few months at best, until the pyramid collapsed and its owners went into hiding. After all, the money was not invested anywhere, but withdrawn to personal accounts. The most resounding pyramids of those years, Kopyor Invest, Russian House of Selling, and of course MMM, which robbed about 15 million Russians according to various estimates. A simple wooden cross at the old building of the Ostankino TV Center is a reminder of the Black October of '93. The country was on the brink of civil war. The impetus was President Yeltsin's televised address on the early dissolution of the Congress of People's Deputies and the Supreme Soviet. The Supreme Soviet, headed by Chairman Ruslan Kaspalatov, called the decision unconstitutional and insisted on impeachment. But the attempt to remove the president from office failed. At the 10th Congress of People's Deputies of the Russian Federation, 617 were in favor, against 689. Tensions were rising. On September 1st, Yeltsin suspended Vice President Alexander Rudsky, one of his main opponents. Rudsky was accused of corruption due to an investigation and lack of assignments. And when the accusations were not confirmed, the president issued Decree number 1400, which provoked mass riots. The decree ordered the Congress of People's Deputies and the Supreme Soviet to cease their activities in order to preserve the unity and integrity of the Russian Federation, accused of making dozens of anti-people decisions. On September 23rd, water, heat, electricity, and communications were cut off at the White House. The building was surrounded by 3 cordons of barbed wire and several thousand military men. On October 3rd, mass riots began. The White House cordon was broken, and a crowd of supporters of Kaspalatov and Rudsky moved to the Ostankin TV Center to seize it. There was a clash at the door. 46 dead, not counting the wounded. And on the morning of October 4th, on Yeltsin's orders, army units began storming the White House. Tanks pounded the parliament. The shooting was not only at the building, on unarmed people in the cordoned-off area. 152 people died. On December 12th, 1993, the new constitution of the Russian Federation was adopted. Executive power was henceforth concentrated in the hands of the president. Another tragic and bloody story of the 90s. The first Chechen campaign, from December 11th of the 94th to August 31st of the 96th. Almost won, despite all the problems in the bloody battles of the Russian army, it was reduced to a humiliating draw, if not a loss, by Yeltsin's government. The Khasavertov Accords ended the fighting, and Russia was overwhelmed by a wave of terrorist attacks. The government withdrew federal troops from the self-proclaimed Chechen Republic of Ishkeria, but international terrorism was gaining influence there and tried to turn it into a springboard for action throughout the region. Even then, it was clear that neither the Russian authorities nor the constructive forces in Chechnya itself could tolerate this state of affairs for long. In the same year of 1996, a 0 kilometer was established in the very center of Moscow near Red Square. According to rumors, this was demanded by the Federal Guard Service in order not to create an additional reason for tourists to gather directly on the square. It was the year of the presidential election. Yeltsin's rating at that time left him no chance for a second term. Unlike the CPRF leader Gennady Zhuganov, the country was tired of reforms. But everything was outplayed by a group of bankers and industrialists who proposed an unprecedented for Russia advertising campaign in the media and on the ground by Western companies. Yeltsin's concert and promotional tour around the country in the company of his favorite pop stars cost a fortune. According to some estimates, the oligarchs splurged $2 billion, but it was worth it. The first president of Russia was re-elected for a second term. Although the issue of vote rigging is still open, well, what is beyond doubt, in the country came the era of semi-bankershchina, by analogy with the semi-boyarshchina of the troubled times. In fact, instead of Yeltsin, the country was ruled by oligarchs. On Monday, August 17th, 1998, at 7 o'clock in the morning, Russia declared a technical default on the main types of state obligations. At the same time, the ruble was released. Although as early as Friday the 14th, Yeltsin had sworn to journalists that there would be no devaluation. The next day, the front page of the Kommersant newspaper carried an article with the headline, "We woke up in another country." And so it was. It was as if Russia had gone for a second round. As in the early 90s, it found itself on the threshold of runaway inflation. Prospects of commodity shortages, broken supply chains, shrinking imports, a black market in currency, and rampant crime. Losses of the Russian economy from the crisis by the most conservative estimates amounted to $96 billion. The gross domestic product decreased by half, from $405 billion to $196. Inflation amounted to 84.5%. But this was really a different country by then. In the long run, devaluation helped the Russian economy to become more competitive. Due to a sharp decline in imports, industry began to rise from the ruins. Medium-sized businesses strengthened their positions. The tax collection system was organized in a smart way. The country even began to repay the national debt. In many ways, the new Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov, who is now remembered mainly for his famous U-turn over the Atlantic, helped pull Russia out of the economic doldrums, in protest against the start of the NATO bombing of Serbia. But it was obvious that Yeltsin would not make it to the end of his term. A new leader who could unite the country was urgently needed. Vladimir Putin eventually became him. The first president of the Russian Federation resigned from his duties as head of state, with which he could no longer cope on December 31st, 1999. And 6 months later, on August 19th, 2000 years ago, on the feast of the Transfiguration of the Lord, he attended the consecration by Patriarch Alexei II of the fully restored Cathedral of Christ the Savior, one of the main symbols of Russia and Russian statehood. The process of its formation was very difficult. There were crises, contradictions, miscalculations, but without it there would be no new Russia. A country that has something to be proud of today.